I have a working theory that theatre is as close as we can come to actual time travel.
Ooh.
And I'm not just saying that because I'm going to see David Tennant in Macbeth tomorrow night. So I've got Doctor Who on the brain. Although there is actually a lot of Doctor Who people on stage in London this summer with John Sim, Ncuti Gatwa, Jodie Whittaker. Anyway, that's a side point.
That's a side point.
But
subject of a later podcast.
Yes, Doctor Who special.
Over theatre.
I was watching Nassim Soleimanpour's brilliant White Rabbit, Red Rabbit last week.
Right, which I haven't seen.
Where they have a special guest performer appearing every night, picking up a script with zero preparation in order to do essentially his script blind and go through the motions. And a large portion of the script is him talking about his experiences in 2010. And therefore, in 2024, he very much highlights the fact that his words now feel present, despite the fact they're 14 years old. So the past is being brought into the present. And he was writing for the future. Gosh, so you see my time travel. So
I'm already confused. It's very early on.
This is very early for time travel. But this is... It's something that strikes me how theatre is one of those occasions where you can see people bring the past into the present, and time periods that feel removed are suddenly all-encompassing. You know, take an obvious example like Shakespeare's Globe. When you have, you know, very orthodox style productions, it is literally like you were back being a groundling in the 16th, 17th century. Here, in other times, when there's a new production or a revival that brings a contemporary spin to the past, you're taking the future and throwing it backwards to imprint it onto a different time period. So this is my working theory about time travel in theatre.
I think it's a really good theory, and I think it's a really good starting point for this week's episode of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton, the critic.
And me, Alex Wood, the time-travelling editor.
Brilliant. Because I have been swept back. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of the last couple of weeks in the 1950s, which is an interesting place to find yourself, both with David Edgar's new play here in America, which is at the Orange Tree Theatre, which is about Arthur Miller and Elia Kazan, titans of the 50s who fell out over the great political argument of the time, which was the McCarthyite witch hunts. And also, more recently, at the Almeida, where John Osborne's Look Back in Anger and Arnold Wesker's Roots have been revived in a sort of double bill. You can choose whether to go and see one or the other. But we saw them on press day in a double session, which is very funny because tangential thought, the press were all given the option of going into the Almeida's rehearsal room in between the two plays, and we sat there like school children sitting in exam, sort of all with our computers out, wondering whether to write or not. And I did write something, but then actually I rewrote it when I got home that evening, so it didn't really count. But it was a very funny moment of critics all in a room together, which is always a terrifying prospect.
There is that. I think it's a dying breed to some extent of the press day, where there'll be these rep productions that will actually mean that critics have to essentially sit together for many, many hours. And almost you start to feel like a small, like, comrades in arms sort of group.
Exactly. The one I remember most vividly, actually, and this is a small shout out for our last week's podcast with James McArdle. Platonov was an all-day session starting at 11 in the morning, 3 plays, adaptations of Chekhov by David Hare, starring James McArdle. And it was a very bonding experience. The effect of the Almeida press day was actually to make you feel that you were immersed in the 50s. I thought that was the interesting thing about it, was that because there wasn't really a break where you left the theatre and entered the modern world, there was a sense of immersion that was quite interesting. And they are very good complementary plays, because Roots is about a woman's self-realisation and Look Back in Anger is supposedly about a man's, though we'll come on perhaps to discuss that a little. And it was fascinating to see them, and hats off to the Almeida for doing it, because I think they're not any longer a particularly easy sell.
Which would you say was the one that really landed for you most in 2024, 70 years or so on?
Somewhat to my surprise, Look Back in Anger. And I was surprised by that, because both plays are blighted by misogyny. There is no doubt that the thing that wasn't moving, if you talk about the world of the 50s being a world of chaos and change and disaffection among young people and a sense of a new society being born, which is very much why they seem pertinent to 2024. The problem was that the movement that really wasn't underway at all was the women's movement. And both plays are male voices imprinting their vision on the world and are very tricky. And Look Back in Anger, I have felt for a very long time, was almost unbearable because of the misogyny of the way that its hero, and he really is the hero, Jimmy Porter, just attacks his wife. I think it makes it, so unpleasant to watch. And it's still very squirmy. But what I noticed, and it is partly thanks to the production, was that there's a sense in which it's Jimmy's disaffection that makes him so awful. And then it becomes a kind of picture of toxic masculinity, which in a way also is something we're dealing with in 2024.
It's funny how you did say before you went to the press performance that was something you were concerned about, was that misogyny. And it clearly is something that the production team had at the forefront of their minds when they were working on it, that this is something they needed to solve quickly and place a lot of emphasis on. And I guess it's something that in the 1950s they almost were highlighting accidentally, like, it was just brought to the text without potentially being a concerted thing.
I think so. I think people just didn't notice it. What they were shocked by and Look Back in Anger was the ironing board, and the fact that suddenly kitchen sink drama had arrived. It was a portrayal of working class life. And the same is true of Wesker's Roots, which is the middle one of his trilogy, which is now known as the Wesker Trilogy, which is essentially a portrait of working class life and the realization of different dreams, different aspirations. I found Wesker more hectoring than I thought I would. I found it hard to feel that his heroine Beatty was fully realised as a character, really, because she's quoting her boyfriend, and it's the boyfriend that Wesker identifies with, and I find that difficult. I have got a story to tell about Wesker, which I feel I might tell. It may affect my view, which was that when I was at school, Arnold Wesker came to, I used to go to a drama club very briefly at the Oxford Playhouse, and Wesker came to give a talk, and he told me that a question I asked was a stupid question.
Wow.
I have never quite managed to forgive him for that moment of humiliation. And I'm sure he didn't really mean it. I'm sure he just wasn't very relaxed dealing with a group of anxious schoolgirls. But it was a strange moment because it is one of those kind of extraordinary examples where, something that you say just in passing can affect somebody for the rest of their life. It's always struck me as a lesson about that as well, about be careful what you say. But it did particularly affect my view of Wesker because I was very keen on Wesker at that point and felt that his depiction of working class life was important. And of course, he has got brilliant heroines. And that moment of being slightly crushed may have marked my attitude to his plays ever since.
Never meet your heroes and all that, I suppose. There was an interesting tweet that I saw from one of our freelance critics, Matt, who had come down from Manchester to see the show, and he was surprised that they had arranged it as Roots and then Look Back in Anger, because Look Back in Anger ends with this sort of crushing solemnity, whereas Roots has sort of like an attempt towards a more positive ending and actually sending people out after 2 press nights with a bit of a gutting, downtrodden conclusion, as opposed to like this sense of euphoria. Is quite an interesting programming choice. It
is, and also actually, it would have made more sense to do them the other way around because Roots is 3 years later than Look Back in Anger. Look Back in Anger is 1956 and Roots is 1959. And yes, I felt that. I felt I would, and also actually Look Back in Anger is longer. So to do the longer play first and then to end in definitely more joyful and funnier. I mean, Roots is a much funnier play. And there's a lot in the texture of the writing I liked. I found that it was a brilliant idea of the Almeida to give it to young directors and see what they made of it.
Yeah.
Most people, I think I should say, really loved the way that Diane Zora had directed Roots. I found that it was a bit distancing. It pushed me away because it's non-naturalistic. And I felt the thing about Roots is that because it's a depiction of rural life in Norfolk, that I wanted to be pulled in. And I wasn't. So I had issues with that. That was not actually a common view. So I liked that slightly less than I liked Look Back in Anger, where the non-naturalism, the sense that Jimmy is staring into the abyss of his own misery, I thought worked really quite well.
Could you also say that there was quite an interesting choice made artistically to have the same cast doing both? You know, the Almeida has essentially brought back a rep company for a few months, which I don't think they've done in a very long time, if ever. And to have these two companies doing the two shows is a deliberate choice. You know, you're not just doing that because you could easily have had two companies.
Yeah, and it is, you know, a brilliant choice. It's like a tribute to the 1950s in itself, you know, that you did see rep companies in the 1950s. That was how my parents grew up watching theatre. And the fact that you do get actors like Morpeth Clark and Billy Howell and Decca Walmsley, that you see them in the two productions. It's great for the actors, I suspect, because they can show different aspects of their playing. But it's also great for an audience because you see, it does increase what I always love about theatre, which is that sense of involvement. So, yeah, I liked that. And I liked the fact that, you know, as I say, the young directors were coming in with their different views of the play. And Atri Banerjee makes a really good job of Look Back in Anger, I think, as a study of toxic masculinity, but it also kind of lets, the language of it is so good. I do think that's the thing I'd not realised until I saw Osborne played, that you can read him and he just goes on and on and on, and you feel a bit tired by this unhappiness that he portrays. But when you hear it spoken, some of the language is so vivid. There's a description of women clattering around upstairs, which you just thought, brilliant writing.
I think Atri Banerjee is definitely one of our most exciting new directors. You look at some of his shows that he's done recently, like The Glass Menagerie on Tour, or Cares, or he did Julius Caesar at the RSC, and I think he made his name doing Hobson's Choice.
Yeah.
So all of these brilliant classics that he's brought back into the 21st century in a big way.
And isn't it interesting that this generation of directors is beginning to look back? It's like it's the right length of time somehow to dig back into the 40s and 50s and see what those plays have to offer.
If I was to make a comparison, could you say that post-Second World War period feels more pertinent now after, you know, something like a global pandemic or giant economic upheaval, that now those plays actually do have a new resonance than they might have done previously or before COVID?
I think what's interesting about them as plays is how big they are. So I think the sort of inspiration, possibly the inspiration for that generation of directors and actors, is that they were willing to tackle the big brave causes. You know, Porter famously says, you know, there are no big brave causes left. And I think the plays are engaging at a very deep level with societal change. And I think it's harder, for lots of reasons now, for playwrights to have quite the same sense of being able to portray a whole society on stage. It's really interesting you mention Hobson's Choice, because talk about time machine travelling. That's a play that was written in 1915 and looks back to 1910, and it's in a Salford mill owner's house where you feel all the constrictions of society falling down on these women who are desperate to escape, desperate to make a life. So, you know, that is a thing that theatre's good at doing, of putting everybody into a TARDIS and whirling you around, not wishing to get this analogy too deep, but also that sense that you could write about big changes. And sometimes I feel that the writing of today is more sectional, that it's about smaller things within the big societal change.
It's funny when shows like Chris Bush's Standing at the Sky's Edge appear and actually do confront everything. You know, you've got the political broadcasts from the 1970s through to excerpts from Theresa May from the 2010s covered in one single play. And that did feel like an oddity because, like you say, I don't think many playwrights are given the canvas large enough or the budget big enough to actually do all-encompassing plays like they used to. So yeah, it's quite a
and there was strongly a definition of political theatre. If you look at Osborne and Wesker, what unites them with playwrights like Miller in America was that they had a definition of using theatre to change how people saw things. The next generation, who are the generation I'd be really quite interested in seeing revive, because they're the ones who influenced my early theatre going, people like Trevor Griffiths saw television as the means of doing that. But in fact, you know, the 40s and 50s are the great time of theatre being the crucible of debate. And, you know, Miller wrote The Crucible based on his experiences under McCarthy and found a way, again, of refracting mirrors of theatre, of using, you know, the sailing witch hunts of the 16th century to make a commentary on modern America. And when you see that play performed as it was last year, it still feels right today when everybody's, you know, factional interest, the fear of the outsider, the sort of sense of rumour and destructiveness of gossip kind of spreads on. And that's why Miller keeps on and on being performed, because he did find those images.
It's funny how the Almeida is going to be stuck in the 1950s well into 2025, because it's got Rebecca Frecknell tackling her third Tennessee Williams play with Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, with Daisy Edgar Jones and Kingsley Ben-Adir leading the cast, after Rebecca had previously done A Streetcar Named Desire and Summer and Smoke at the same venue. I mean, those are late 1940s plays, but sort of kind of fall into a similar theme in terms of trying to embrace an entire society, but through a small, relatively domestic drama in the case of A Streetcar Named Desire, but then amplified massively. So I'm very excited to see what she does with A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, because she's another one of those slightly iconoclastic directors that is totally willing to pull apart material to see what's actually beating underneath. And I think that's what these two plays did at the Almeida.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you think about going forward? One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is how hard it is to keep a repertory of plays running. I mean, it will be something that faces India Rubisingham when she takes over at the National. It's something that faces Rupert Gould. You know, he's done so much great new writing at the Almeida, but he also does obviously have itches to look back a bit. And it's tricky about keeping that balance between new writing and the older plays that you still want to see. And what I do notice at the moment is that plays that previous generation of critics really revered, I mean, it's come up slightly with my Death of Maggie Smith, that plays like the Restoration comedies now, which she made her name in, kind of are really struggling to maintain their place in the repertory. And I think it is because those post-war plays seem to resonate better now. And if you manage to make a production where it contains eternal verities rather than specific verities, then it does speak to today. That was what was interesting about seeing Wesker and Osborne. They're less good than Miller, I would say, controversially, about keeping an ongoing sense. They do seem more bound in their own time.
It was interesting. There was a fascinating column in The Stage by Kate Maltby about Here in America, and talking about the misogyny that exists there as well, with the character of Marilyn Monroe and how she's sort of very peripheral to the action, and actually that is probably truthful of the period, but then it's a play in the 21st century. How far are you allowed to actually still make that character feel like she's more of just a cardboard cutout than actually present in the action, I suppose, is a tricky question.
Yeah, goes on and on. I can tell my misogynistic story about Pamela Lane, who was John Osborne's first wife, on whom Look Back in Anger is absolutely based. I mean, to the point where she went to see the first night and saw his then mistress, subsequently second wife, Mary Yore, at the ironing board and went, oh, the ironing board, and, you know, recognised the reality of the conversations that they'd had. And though they fallen out quite badly. I think towards the end of their lives, they used to meet and talk. And she had this extraordinary story where she was an actress and she went to audition for Look Back in Anger and was told that she wasn't suitable for the part of Alison.
Despite the fact that it was based on her.
Entirely based on her, and actually often quoted her words. And I feel that she was a victim of the misogyny that the play depicts.
If there's ever a cause for an identity crisis, I think being told that you're not truthful to yourself is one of them.
It must have been terrible, absolutely terrible for her. But yeah, it is interesting, and so that's the disadvantage of time travel, I guess, isn't it? What you do with the fact that very often women are underwritten. And it was striking in the David Edgar play that I felt he could probably not have involved Monroe or indeed Kazan's wife in the conversation, that he could have made it just a kind of, bullet-headed locking of horns between two men. But he did bring in the women and they did become peripheral, which was problematic. I felt in terms of a modern play where they didn't really have enough voice, even though he tried to give them a voice.
The thing that I've noticed with quite a few of these directors is that what they'll look for when they're reviving these plays, like Atri Banerjee or Rebecca Frecknell, is they won't be looking for what the text says necessarily. Sometimes they'll be looking for what's between the lines, where can a pause be found and what can happen during that pause that might otherwise be unsaid, but might be done, that can completely change the power dynamic of a scene or completely alter how you perceive a certain character. I think that was something that Rebecca Frecknell was very keen on doing in her production of A Streetcar Named Desire. So, for example, having Paul Mescal's Stanley sprinting around the stage, almost creating like a boxing ring, like this donut of masculine toxicity within which two women had to operate. And he suddenly felt like he was prowling around the stage and they had to be confined within his orbit. And that's not something that's necessarily within the text, but it's something that suddenly really appears to you, especially when you've got Hollywood superstar Paul Mescal playing Stanley, yes. Is that part of you naturally does just gravitate to seeing what he's doing. And if he's just prowling like an animal to some extent, as the text does describe Stanley as quite often, but actually to do that in a silent way does bring out that sort of toxic masculinity aspect of that production.
Yeah, and I do think that is very much what Banerjee has done with Look Back in Anger, because the sense of, he emphasises Alison's sense of suffering. I mean, there are lots of ways that Alison has been played down the years. I mean, Emma Thompson has played her very much as a kind of antagonist of really making her silence a weapon against Branagh's Jimmy Porter, which was the last big production I remember seeing. So what Banerjee and Elora Torture, who plays Alison, do is very much emphasise her misery and her suffering and her sense of being trapped in a toxic relationship and under coercive control. And that is a completely valid reading of the play. It doesn't alter its impact at all in the sense of what the play is trying to say about the sense of society being stultified and needing change. But it does give her an agency that I don't think actually Osborne's words do. And it was the same with Beattie as well, that in Roots, she is given a kind of gleam of power that is inherent in the writing, but it means the final staging gives her a moment of self-realization separate from her boyfriend that I'm not absolutely sure is there in the writing. So yeah, it is impressive to see people mining new ways in. Despite my reservations about Wesker, I would quite like to see the entire trilogy now, because I think Chicken Soup and Barley is a play that I would be interested in seeing revived. And again, put through the thought process of a different generation of director. I feel I haven't seen quite a lot of 50s stuff that I probably should have seen. I mean, are there things that you feel that and they do play differently in a theatre than on the page. So you can read them and know they're significant, but actually to see them staged is where they come to life and you have a different sense of them. Are there plays that you would like to see that were prominent when you were first coming to theatre that people talked about?
I remember in 2017 there was that Zinnie Harris version of Ionesco's Rhinoceros that was on at the International Festival that had some relatively tepid responses, but I've loved Ionesco's play. I think it is one of the best satires talking about, the latent rise of fascism or anti-immigrant sentiment, which, as we can see, we have these absurd figures that exist in this contemporary political sphere that actually start coaxing more and more individuals into their orbit. So, looking at the number of votes for certain far-right parties in the most recent election tells you all you need to know. And that's a 1959 play, so tick 1950s.
Yeah.
Also now actually going back to the Almeida in a new production by Omar Illyrian. So another Almeida 1950s big win. But I've always loved that Ionesco play, and I've sort of read as many adaptations of it as I can, because I still think it's a very easy idea, almost like a Stepford Wives-esque parable about how easily we can be seduced and replaced by someone that is hate-fueled and xenophobic and aggressive. But that can happen imperceptibly to certain people or just generally in society. So I think that there's going to be a really fascinating spin to put on that play now as we hit 2024 with this rise of far-right movements across both the UK and Europe. We're seeing this indomitable rise of huge political parties in lots of different countries. And actually, what was Ionesco telling us back then that we aren't listening to now?
Yeah, I'd like to see that. And of course, the other play we totally forgotten in this 1950s fest is Waiting for Godot, which again is on stage at the Haymarket with Ben Whishaw, Lucian Msamati, Jonathan Slinger and Tom Eden, giving a really, really different take on Godot, I felt, than any I had seen. And making it absolutely a play of warning about the treatment of the outsider, poverty, climate change, and everything, and totally resonating in our times now, and yet also taking you back to the moment when Beckett was writing it. It does feel like a creative whirlpool where a lot of thought was going into theatre and what was happening there.
I do wonder if we're entering a new period of absurdist revivals. There's so little sense to make of the world that all we can do is just try and satirize it in as many ways as we can. Look at Dr. Strangelove coming back in the next few weeks. Maybe that's, again, something that we're discovering about the 2020s is, this isn't going to be a 1920s style period of hedonism and champagne parties. It's going to be something darker and different to that.
Yeah. And that's definitely true with Strangelove. I mean, fascinating to see how that's going to play on stage, how that's going to read. And it does seem as if that time of the 50s, when you're in the grip of great social change, but also incredible threatening forces from outside, that the threat of nuclear annihilation, which, without wishing to get too heavy on this podcast, especially as we're reaching the end, but there is the case that really we have been living with the threat of nuclear annihilation being forefronted and backgrounded in our minds since the 1950s. Certainly that was the condition of my parents growing up. And certainly that hangs over all these plays, the idea that the world might actually end and the uncertainty and what we're actually doing with our lives. And I think we are in another period where that feels very present and very frightening.
So how do you grapple with the end of the world if it could happen in the middle of a performance? Sorry, very dark.
So dark, I can't even go there. I think that takes you to the whole idea of would you rather die in the theatre than anywhere else? Which
Sorry, we've landed in a morbid conclusion.
No, I think we should move off from that.
Yeah.
No, but I think you're right that time travel allows us to look at the past in a different way. And time travelling through drama is in some ways as instructive and as revealing as time travelling through history. I think it is no coincidence that alongside these revivals, you also have a revived popularity of history itself in terms of podcasts, in terms of television programs, in terms of films. You know, Oppenheimer, again, was about this kind of the great post-war period. And I think, which encompassed both, you know, the bomb that changed everything and the anti-communist witch hunt that followed. And I think we are sitting at a moment where the 50s is a very revealing time to us.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up. It's funny that also people will be listening to this a week on from when we're recording it. So time traveling a week into the future by the time this actually goes live. Anyway.
So have a happy week of time traveling.
So here's my message to the far future. Please, if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and leave a comment wherever you can. We'll be back every week with lots of lovely chats, interviews, and discussions of the end of the world. So make sure you tune in again for the next one. But in the meantime, it's a goodbye from me, Alex Wood.
And a goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.